December 1982, America was suffocating. The unemployment rate had climbed to numbers the country hadn't seen since the Great Depression, 10.8% of the workforce locked out. President Reagan had just wielded the budget axe on social welfare programs, and places like Pontotoc County, Oklahoma felt the blade hardest. This wasn't a prosperous agricultural region anymore. The wheat fields were still there, but the factories were emptying. Young people with ambition had already left for the cities. Those who stayed were stuck. Ada, the county seat, held about 16,000 people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name because there wasn't anyone else to talk to. The economy of the town revolved around a handful of main streets lined with churches, a state university campus, and bars that stayed open well past when they probably should have. These were escape hatches for people with nowhere to go. In this environment, a 21-year-old girl named Deborah Sue Carter was doing what ambitious young people do, clawing her way toward independence. She'd just moved into a small garage apartment, her first place living alone. The milestone should have mattered more than it did. To keep herself afloat, she'd cobbled together 3 part-time jobs, bartending and waitressing at a place called the Coach Light Club, babysitting for local families, and whatever odd jobs would pay cash. Her signature at the Coach Light was a Western-style belt with her name engraved on it, Debbie, that she wore nearly every shift. Coworkers remembered her, customers knew her name, and her mother would later describe her as mischievous, full of energy, someone with a good heart and solid principles. On the evening of December 7th, a regular Tuesday night, Deborah worked her shift at the Coach Light. The bar was quieter than usual. Winter weather and a collapsing economy meant people conserved their drinking for better times. As the night wound down and customers filed out, a regular named Glenn Gore, 22 years old, positioned himself in the parking lot next to Deborah's car. They talked through the window. Some people leaving noticed nothing unusual, just 2 people who knew each other making conversation before heading home. Others saw something different. They watched as Deborah pushed him away to close her car door. She left alone. Gore went back inside, eventually leaving with his friend Ron West. This moment in the parking lot would become the hinge on which an entire injustice would turn. Around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, Deborah's friend Gina Vietta's phone rang. Deborah was on the other end, voice tight, saying that someone was in her apartment and she didn't feel safe, asking Vietta to pick her up. When Vietta asked who, Deborah wouldn't answer. Just hold on. Vietta heard rustling, confused noises, a struggle beneath the words. She told Deborah she was coming right away. Then her phone went quiet. Minutes later, it rang again. Deborah this time telling her not to come. She'd decided to stay. She asked Vietta to call in the morning so she wouldn't be late for work. It was the last time her friend would hear her voice. The next morning, Deborah's co-worker Donna Johnson came by the apartment to check on her. The scene she walked into would haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. The bedroom looked like a tornado had touched down, clothes scattered, bedding torn apart, stuffed animals thrown around as if someone had been searching for something in a panic. Deborah lay face down on the floor between the bed and the wall, naked except for socks. A towel had been jammed so far down her throat, it had to be removed by emergency responders. But the body was only part of what made people retch. The killer had left messages. On her chest, the word die written in nail polish. On her back, a name written in ketchup, Duke Graham. On a table in the room, another message in ketchup, misspelled angry, don't look for us or eels. The murderer so agitated he couldn't spell. The us and we were deliberate, suggesting multiple attackers to throw investigators off. A ketchup bottle lay uncapped beside the body, the same one used to write these words. Shampoo bottles sat open, their contents smeared on the victim's skin as if weaponized. Money was scattered on the floor, not robbery, but staging. Glass covered the landing and the bedroom window, broken in a way that crime scene experts would later determine couldn't happen naturally. It had to have been broken from both directions. Everything about the scene screamed one thing. A single person had created an elaborate fiction of multiple attackers, a break-in, chaos and violence beyond what actually occurred. The medical examiner documented the brutality methodically. Bruises across her face and neck. Bite marks inside her mouth, a ligature mark scarring her throat, defensive wounds on her arms where she'd fought back, small puncture marks on her nose and cheeks. The examiner couldn't fully explain. Internal examination revealed a metal bottle cap in her rectum and internal bleeding. She had fought, she had resisted. The cause of death was asphyxiation, the towel crammed down her throat combined with the ligature around her neck. Police recovered 17 hairs, body fluid samples, and a bloody fingerprint on the bedroom wall. All of it would sit in evidence storage untouched for 5 years. Ronald Keith Williamson was born in Ada in 1953, the youngest of 3 children. But unlike Deborah, who had to fight for her place in the world, Williamson was born into something that mattered in a small Oklahoma town: baseball talent. By his late high school years, he was the kind of kid everyone knew, not because of trouble, but because scouts were watching. In 1971, at 18 years old, he was drafted as the 41st overall pick in the National Amateur Draft. Not many kids from rural Oklahoma made it that far. He played in the Yankees organization for 2 years, close enough to make the dream feel real before a shoulder injury ended it. He was 24 years old and had already lost everything that defined him. He came back to Ada with no money, no plan, and nothing but a name that used to make people look at him with respect. Now it just reminded everyone what he'd failed to become. Over the next decade, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, severe depression, and schizophrenia, a trifecta of mental illnesses that left him untreated, self-medicating with alcohol and whatever drugs he could find. He lived with his mother, had no steady income, and gradually became the town's cautionary tale. Drunk, singing loudly at night, mowing lawns without being asked, showing up in the wrong places at the wrong times, the living embodiment of what happens when mental illness goes untreated in a small town with no resources. He frequented the Coach Light Club, the same bar where Deborah worked, the same bar where Glenn Gore drank on the night she died. Dennis Fritz was the opposite. He was a high school science teacher with a stable job, a normal life, and nothing in his background suggesting he could hurt anyone. He met Williamson in 1981, and they became friends, occasionally drinking together at the Coach Light on free nights. That friendship and nothing else would destroy his life. In March 1983, 3 months after Deborah Carter's death, Glenn Gore walked into an Ada police station and told officers he'd seen Williamson at the Coach Light on December 7th, and that Williamson had been harassing Carter. Police brought Williamson in for questioning. He denied involvement and volunteered hair and saliva samples, the cooperative response of someone who believed he had nothing to fear. His mother confirmed he was home by 10 p.m. before the Coach Light even closed, before Gore ever stood next to Carter's car. Meanwhile, Gore, the man who'd been pushed away by the victim, the last person confirmed to have seen her alive, left the police station without providing a single biological sample. Not fingerprints, not hair, not saliva. Nothing. The investigation should have pivoted. Instead, it narrowed. 3 pieces of evidence that could have changed everything got buried in prosecutorial files. A bloody fingerprint on the bedroom wall was examined by Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation expert Jerry Peters in 1983. His conclusion: it didn't belong to Carter, didn't belong to Williamson, didn't belong to Fritz. That result never saw the light of day. When Williamson took a polygraph test that same year, he gave an exculpatory videotape statement explaining exactly what he knew and didn't know. That tape disappeared into the files. When a man named Ricky Joe Simmons walked into police and confessed to killing Deborah Carter, that confession also vanished, locked away by District Attorney Bill Peterson with no intention of sharing it. For 5 years, the case froze. No arrests, no breakthroughs. But pressure was building like steam in a closed container. A small town with an unsolved murder couldn't sleep. The Carter family couldn't accept that their daughter's killer was still free. Ada wanted closure, wanted someone to pay, wanted the nightmare to end. In October 1984, Williamson was jailed for writing bad checks and shared a cell with a woman named Terry Holland. Holland claimed to have heard Williamson describe a dream about the Carter murder, a dream in which he played the role of detective, investigating the crime, not the perpetrator. Holland's statement was documented and filed away, waiting for the moment when prosecutors would need it. That moment came in 1987. In May of that year, with the pressure finally becoming unbearable and 5 years having passed without resolution, Peterson and Ada police made a decision. They would exhume Deborah Carter's body, ostensibly to obtain new fingerprints for comparison. Jerry Peters was called back to examine the bloody fingerprint on the bedroom wall. The same fingerprint he had examined 4 years earlier and concluded didn't match any suspect. This time, he reached the opposite conclusion. The fingerprint, Peters now said, matched Deborah Carter. It was her own fingerprint, not evidence of an intruder or attacker. This was the first reversal of his own findings in Peters' 24-year career. No scientific explanation was offered for the contradiction. Same fingerprint, same examiner. Completely different conclusion arrived at precisely when prosecutors needed a reason to make arrests. With that, the arrest warrants were signed on May 8, 1987, 5 years after Deborah called Gina Vieta in the middle of the night. Ronald Williamson and Dennis Fritz were arrested. Instructed almost entirely from absence of alibi, absence of witnesses, absence of anything concrete. He was a high school teacher with no criminal history, no credible motive, and the only connection to the crime was that he'd sometimes visited the coach light with Williamson. But absence could be weaponized, and the prosecution did so skillfully. The centerpiece of the case against Fritz was a jailhouse informant, a woman incarcerated with him after his arrest who claimed he'd confessed to the murder. This testimony appeared exactly 1 day before rules would have forced the prosecution to release Fritz for insufficient evidence. 1 day, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. Life without parole. A science teacher who'd done nothing wrong was sentenced to spend the rest of his existence in an Oklahoma prison, and his daughter would grow up visiting her father behind glass. Williamson's trial began on April 21, 1988, and what happened in that courtroom was one of the clearest demonstrations of a justice system failing someone who couldn't defend himself. Williamson was represented by a blind lawyer who had minimal resources to prepare a defense. More critically, no one ever requested a mental competency evaluation, despite the fact that Williamson was in an active psychotic state, suffering from untreated schizophrenia and bipolar disorder so severe that his behavior in court made it obvious to anyone paying attention. Throughout the proceedings, Williamson screamed at witnesses and the judge. He overturned tables. He lost emotional control in ways that a person in a psychotic state literally cannot control. The jury didn't understand that what they were watching was illness. They interpreted it as dangerousness, confirmation that this was a person capable of the violence he was accused of committing. No mental health professional explained the difference to them. Glenn Gore took the stand as the prosecution's primary witness. The man who'd been pushed away by Deborah in the parking lot, the man from whom no samples had ever been taken, the man who'd left the police station years earlier, untested and unmeasured. He testified under oath that he'd seen Williamson harassing Carter at the coach light on December 7th. This was the only testimony placing Williamson at the bar that night. Among the 23 other people present that evening, people who'd known Williamson for years, not one confirmed seeing him there. Only Gore, the prosecution, built its case on what they called evidence, but what was actually a collection of mechanisms designed to trap the innocent. First, there were the 17 hairs recovered from the scene. An OSBI expert testified that 13 were microscopically consistent with both men and one was a match. These words sounded scientific, but they were deceptive. Microscopic consistency meant the hairs looked similar under a microscope, something that could be true for tens of thousands of people with the same basic hair color and texture. The defense attorneys never pointed this out. No one told the jury that the same hairs could just as easily have proven innocence as guilt. Second, there were jailhouse informants. Beyond the woman who testified against Fritz, Terry Holland was brought forward to describe Williamson's dream as if it were a confession. The distinction between describing a dream and confessing to a crime was never explained. Third, there was the dream itself. In 1984, Williamson had told a detective about a dream where he played the role of a detective investigating Carter's murder, describing what happened to her, following her home. The prosecution presented this narrative to the jury without context, without explaining that Williamson was describing himself as the investigator, not the perpetrator. The jury heard descriptions of murder and was told it was a confession. Fourth, there was what was never said. The 1983 videotape of Williamson's exculpatory statement, the Ricky Joe Simmons confession, Brady disclosures that should have been handed over, all remained hidden. Williamson of first-degree murder, death by lethal injection. 2 years later, Williamson was transferred to a new death row facility, an underground building with no windows and no natural light, designed specifically to isolate death row inmates from the world completely. His cell was just over 7 feet by 15 feet. He went weeks without showering. He barely ate. He paced in that concrete box and screamed his innocence, behavior that guards didn't recognize as symptoms of untreated schizophrenia deteriorating under complete isolation, but rather as the ravings of a dangerous man. Each cell had an intercom system connecting to the guard station. Some guards found creative uses for that technology. Late at night, whispers would come through the speaker in Williamson's cell. "Ron, this is God. Why did you kill Debbie Carter?" to a man with schizophrenia who couldn't distinguish hallucination from reality. These whispers were indistinguishable from divine judgment. He'd scream for hours, loud enough that death row inmates in nearby cells couldn't sleep. The guards had made their point. No one was disciplined. From his underground cell, Williamson learned that Ricky Joe Simmons had actually confessed to killing Deborah Carter. He demanded repeatedly, through every channel he could access, that Simmons be investigated, arrested, prosecuted. His demands were dismissed as the rantings of a psychotic death row inmate, not information worth taking seriously. By September 1994, an execution date had been set. September 27th. On September 26th, with 5 days remaining before Williamson would be strapped to a table and injected with lethal drugs, his public defender filed a habeas corpus petition. A stay of execution was granted. When Williamson learned the news in his underground cell, he didn't celebrate or cry. He screamed, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent." 5 days. That was the distance between Ronald Keith Williamson and wrongful execution. When Williamson's federal appeals process began, lawyers reviewed the entire case file. In 1995, the federal judge granted the habeas corpus petition and ordered a new trial, listing in his ruling every single violation that had occurred: the Brady violations with the videotape and the Simmons confession, the ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to request a competency evaluation, the prosecutorial misconduct layered throughout. Dennis Fritz, meanwhile, was taking matters into his own hands from his prison cell. He contacted the Innocence Project, the nonprofit organization founded in 1992 specifically to use DNA testing to free the wrongfully convicted. He understood that the physical evidence from 1982 still existed: 17 hairs, body fluid samples, and that DNA testing could prove his innocence. But first, he needed to make sure that evidence wasn't destroyed before it could be tested. He filed a motion to preserve the evidence, a strategic decision that may have saved his own life, and Williamson's. In 1997, Fritz's federal appeal was also granted for similar reasons. In 1999, Williamson's attorney Mark Barrett obtained permission to test DNA on all the physical evidence collected from Deborah Carter's apartment in 1982. The results were decisive and brutal in their clarity. The DNA didn't match Williamson, didn't match Fritz, completely excluding both men from having left any genetic material at the scene. The intact sperm samples from the vaginal and rectal swabs taken during the autopsy didn't match either man. The DNA matched Glenn Gore. On April 15, 1999, Judge Tom Landreth sat on the bench and dismissed all charges against both men. 11 years and 5 days separated Ron Williamson's arrest from his exoneration. When the judge read the order, Williamson said only 3 words: "Thank you, Judge." Dennis Fritz sat with his mother and daughter and spoke about the anger, the bitterness, the pain so profound that he was determined to prevent it from happening to anyone else. Glenn Gore was still alive when the DNA results came back. Still in prison for a kidnapping and assault conviction unrelated to Deborah Carter, still breathing, still aware that science had just confirmed what he'd always known. The DNA broke on April 14, 1999. On April 15, Williamson and Fritz were released. Gore knew what was coming. He escaped from a public work crew, a desperate reflex with no real plan, no genuine chance of success. He was recaptured within days. In 2001, he was charged with Deborah Carter's rape and murder. In 2003, 21 years after Deborah called Gina Vietta in the middle of the night, a jury convicted Glenn Gore and sentenced him to life without parole. The man who had fingered an innocent rival to police, who had testified against Williamson in court, who had lived free while 2 men served time for his crime, was finally where he belonged. Ron Williamson walked out of the Ada courthouse on a spring morning, legally free but fundamentally broken. 11 years in an underground dungeon had destroyed what remained of his sanity. He couldn't distinguish police officers at his door from hallucinations. He carried a pocket knife around town, not from aggression but from terror. His family struggled to keep him medicated, but alcohol and medication didn't mix. He cycled in and out of psychiatric facilities repeatedly. In his clearer moments, he stood outside prisons advocating for clemency for death row inmates. On December 4, 2004, Ronald Keith Williamson died at a nursing home in Oklahoma, surrounded by his sisters who had fought for him every day he was inside and cared for him every day he was out. He'd lived only 5 years in freedom. He was 51 years old. Dennis Fritz took a different path. He returned to Missouri, rebuilt his life from rubble, and found ways to make meaning from the theft of 11 years. He served on the board of the Midwest Innocence Project. In 2008, he published a memoir called Journey Toward Justice. He and Williamson each received $500,000 from the city of Ada, and Oklahoma settled separately with an undisclosed amount. In a moment no one could have written in advance, Deborah Carter's mother, Peggy Carter Sanders, built a friendship with Dennis Fritz in the years after the exoneration. At an Innocence Project fundraiser in New York, Fritz walked over to Mrs. Sanders, the woman whose daughter he'd been convicted of murdering, and invited her to dance with him while jazz played. Two people who'd started on opposite sides of a tragedy stood together on a stage, choosing connection over continued separation. On March 10, 2024, Dennis Fritz passed away at 74 years old. The question this case poses is fundamental. How could this happen in a modern justice system designed with every safeguard specifically to prevent it? The answer isn't a single catastrophic error. It's 5 layers of institutional failure stacked on top of each other. First, investigators overlooked the obvious suspect from day one. The person who'd argued with Deborah in the parking lot, who'd been pushed away by her, who'd left questioning with no biological samples. Gore was never seriously pursued. Second, when 5 years passed and pressure mounted, a fingerprint conclusion was reversed without scientific justification. Same expert, same evidence, opposite conclusion exactly when prosecutors needed it. Third, 2 pieces of potentially exonerating evidence were withheld by the prosecutor. Brady violations, plural, in a single case. Fourth, junk science was presented as definitive fact. Microscopic hair analysis, a technique later proven by the FBI to be unreliable, was delivered to the jury as if it was cutting-edge forensic certainty. Fifth, a man experiencing active psychosis was tried without anyone checking whether he was mentally competent to stand trial, and his mental illness was weaponized in court as evidence of guilt. After this case, the FBI officially acknowledged that microscopic hair analysis was not validated science and reviewed thousands of cases nationwide. The question that raised was how many other people were sitting in cells because of the same flawed testimony with no one fighting for them. The Innocence Project, energized by cases like Williamson and Fritz, became one of the most powerful legal organizations in America. It has now exonerated more than 375 people. The foundation of their influence was built partly on this case, on the determination of 2 innocent men and the lawyers who refused to let them die. But beneath all those numbers, all those reforms, all those legal precedents is Deborah Sue Carter, 21 years old, working 3 jobs, wearing a belt with her name engraved on it, calling a friend at 2:30 in the morning to say someone was in her apartment, and she wasn't safe. She deserved to have the truth discovered in 1982, not in 1999. She deserved not to have her tragedy compounded by the system's injustice. She deserved justice immediately, not after 2 innocent men nearly died in her place. The machinery of justice, once it starts moving in the wrong direction, is almost impossible to stop.